Well, we're in the real home stretch in our series on practicing the way. Last week we asked the question, who in your life needs a sycamore tree? Who do you need to help make space for the gospel so they might see or hear or be able to access the good news about Jesus and the kingdom of God? And we were looking at the first of three practices or three rhythms that John Mark Comer says kind of capture Jesus' ministry. So the first was making space for the gospel. Well, today we're going to try and have a very, very brief look at the next two. We're mainly going to be focusing on preaching the gospel. And I'm just going to make a quick reference to demonstrating the gospel. We've had to truncate the series a little because of different things that have happened. So we're going to have one more sermon to close next week, and that's actually about a rule of life. So you would have heard Annette this morning praying for a half-day retreat that's coming up. You're all invited to that. So it's April the 12th, it's a Saturday. And we're going to be taking time on that day to explore well, not so much explore, but actually take time to evaluate our rule of life. We all have one. We all have ways that we live, things that govern our choices and our time and what we do. Sometimes they're perhaps unintentional or unconscious. And on that day, we're going to take some time to actually look at what is and look at whether there's areas that the Lord is prompting us to be intentional about adjusting in our lives. So that's coming up. But today, let's explore this idea of preaching the gospel. What image comes to mind for you when you hear this term, preach the gospel? Sorry? The Bible, yep. Yes, so obviously that points us in the direction of the gospel, but what is someone standing up the front, someone preaching. I mean, this is what I do every week. I preach the gospel every week. Street corner preaching, yes, that's often the one that comes to my mind when you read, and right throughout the New Testament it says, go and preach the gospel. And I have these pictures of people standing on shop corners, handing things out, sometimes with obnoxiously loud microphones and the like. Now, I want to encourage you, when John Mark Comer is engaging with this topic of preaching the gospel, he's not calling us to do that. He's not asking us to go and stand in the public somewhere and, grab a microphone and literally try and preach to a bunch of people walking past. It's a good thing, though. Well, maybe. Jesus, let's start with Jesus. Yes, he did preach in public. He did preach in open spaces and he did preach to the masses. But he was a rabbi. And preaching was part of his work. So he used to go into synagogues, he used to travel around to different synagogues, and at the very start of his ministry we see that probably the local rabbi in the meeting there invites him to stand and speak. It was normal if a traveling rabbi or teacher, so Greeks did this as well, they travelled around from town to town and preached. It was normal for them to be invited, and not just in the synagogue, but they'd preach in the marketplace, they'd preach out in a field, and people often wanted to gather and hear what a travelling preacher would say. See, there were no podcasts, there were no radios, there were no newspapers, there were no TVs, there were no movie theatres. So when a travelling speaker came to town, people were eager to hear a different voice. They were eager to hear stories from somewhere else in the world. And so they gave ear and they wanted to listen and hear if this speaker had something interesting to say. Jesus operated in a way that was largely culturally normal. For us to go and stand on a street corner and preach today is not culturally normal. It's culturally weird. People don't often want to stop and listen when they are out doing their shopping. What they want to do is get their list ticked off, and they want to do it without being hassled. Hence why making space for the gospel is part of our mission. That's why we highlighted that last week. Well, instead of trying to preach on a street corner, John Mark Comer tries to steer us toward a practice that is culturally normal in our time. He reminds us that everyone preaches a gospel of some kind. So, good news. We're just going to insert that word there. Everyone tries to share good news. People love to share about their lives. They love to share good news. As an example, I have had multiple people try and convince me that I should invest in cryptocurrency. One of them is my next door neighbour. Another is one of the parents of one of my son's friends. And they are not encouraging me to do this because they are going to make money out of it, or they're not trying to sell something. It's because they have invested in cryptocurrency and they have made money. And so they're like, Andrew, you don't want to miss out on this. You should get on this. And so they are preaching something for them that is good news. People find a good food joint. They normally love to let you know, hey, have you been to this restaurant? You should check this out. If people find a new exercise program like Pilates or yoga, and they have found it to be really helpful, particularly if it has cured a pain they've had for years, they will let you know. A number of years ago, it was CrossFit. Sorry, there's an old joke that how do you know if someone does CrossFit? Because they've told you 13 times. Like CrossFitters used to always be, oh, do you do CrossFit? I do CrossFit. I don't know if you had any CrossFit friends, but I had a fellow youth pastor who was a CrossFitter, and every time we met up, he would tell us about CrossFit. So, people tell their friends things that they're excited about, things that have been good for them. More than that, we're constantly, in small ways, publishing and testing our beliefs against others. We do it in politics, in all sorts of things. We sort of test, do these people agree with me? We talk about what's happening in Ukraine, and we'll be very gentle and talk in very generalized terms before we get some signals back that we see the other person's on the same side of the fence as us. Then we'll jump into it, right? We do this kind of stuff all the time. So John Mark Comer says the question isn't, are you preaching a gospel? It's what gospel are you preaching? What do you talk about? What are you talking about? In the book, Comer points to a survey done in the US by the Barna Group. So Barna is a massive social research group in the States and happens to be a Christian organisation. In Australia, we have McCrindle. They're probably one of the leading social researchers in Australia, and they're also, Mark McCrindle is a Christian. He has a great podcast if you ever want to subscribe to it. But in this study from the States, John Mark Comer highlights that 96% of millennial Christians said that part of their faith means being a witness about Jesus. 94% of them agreed that the best thing that could ever happen to someone is for them to come to know Jesus. So it's nearly all of them on the first two. Now, less than half of them agree that you should share those beliefs with someone in the hope that they will one day share the same belief as you. So 47% said it is wrong to share one's personal beliefs with someone in the hope that one day they may share the same faith as you. That is a staggering conflict of beliefs, or contradiction of beliefs. How can you believe both things at the same time? If you genuinely believe that Jesus is the best news, genuinely believe that he's the best thing for the people around you, how could you think it is somehow morally wrong to share that with the hope that someone would grab hold of him? So that's America, but I suspect among millennials in Australia, the stats wouldn't be too far different actually. So millennials, Gen X, but I would say even the generations that have come after, they would probably have fairly similar beliefs. I'm totally guessing, but that's my anecdotal or observational sense. The world has conditioned many of us to think that it is okay to share good news so as long as it isn't about our faith, because that's private. That's personal. You keep that to yourself. So I want to pause here and invite you to reflect on these questions. What do you believe? Do you believe that Jesus is good news? And do you believe it's wrong to share that news with others in the hopes that they will share that same belief? What does your gut tell you about those responses? Now, I suspect many of us are saying, no, I believe it is good to share that news. But for those in the room who are quite shy about that idea, just acknowledge that. Personally, I want to say I don't think it makes sense to answer yes to both of those questions. If you answer yes to both of them, I think it's a contradiction. And I think it's one that we need to wrestle with. The scriptures tell us that Jesus came for everyone. He came for everyone. And then Jesus himself says, "No one lights a lamp only to hide it under a basket." The good news isn't meant to be private. It isn't meant to be something that we know about and then we just keep it as our little secret. So how do we manage this tension? And there is a tension, because in Australia, I would say there is a cultural expectation that we won't go around telling everyone what they should believe or telling other people that their beliefs are wrong. That is part of our culture, and I think it is a strong part of our culture. And I want to say, I actually think we need to be careful to respect that. Now, I'm not saying that we never go against the grain on that, but we have to be careful to be aware of that dynamic and be careful not to rub people the wrong way on that. I don't think Jesus wants us to be known as people who are abusive, overbearing, disrespectful, cajoling. So we have to be careful how we engage. We don't want to earn a reputation as people who judge others, especially when Jesus says, "I didn't come into the world to judge it." Those are his words. That was not his motivation. It was not to come into the world and tell everyone how wrong they are and be condemning. That was not his motivation. His motivation was to save it. His motivation was to seek and save the lost. So John Mark Comer says our role is to be witnesses, not salespeople. Our role is simply to share what we see, not to convince or to cajole, not to try and get someone across some kind of line, but to share what we see is good news. And we can share our good news. When people ask how you are going or what you did on the weekend, we absolutely can share that we spent time worshipping and praying and we loved it. We can share that we went to church with a bunch of other Christians and that was a highlight of our weekend. We can share when one of our prayers has been answered. We can let people know, I've been praying for this for ages and I'm so excited something good has happened here. We can let people know that we are people of prayer, that we expect that there is a God out there who listens and a God who answers our prayers. We can share when we join in and go to someone's house and serve, when we do service projects and things like that. We can share that we are part of a community that blesses and serves and bears one another's burdens in love. Depending on the relationship, we can even share what we think the Lord is speaking to us about. You know, if the Lord is calling you to be more reflective, if there's a verse that he's been putting on your heart, there are relationships where you can easily share that and say, you know, this has been going on for me. We absolutely are allowed to share our experiences and what is real for us. And as we do that, we may find there are people who want to hear more. We may find that there are people who are not rolling their eyes at us. There are people who are going, oh, that sounds really good. And there may be then opportunities to go a step further and say something like, hey, I've been looking for someone to read the Bible with. I don't know, would you be interested? It's not forceful. It's not cajoling. The person is in full power, full control, and they can either say yes, they can say no. But we can share what is real for us. I'm going to finish up today by putting a couple of slides up. Actually, I think I've only got one. To summarise what John... No, I do have two. Trying to remember what's in my PowerPoint. About what John Mark Comer says about preaching the gospel. So in this section about preaching the gospel, John Mark Comer says that all of these key ingredients are needed. So offer hospitality. Find where God is working and join him. So be praying and watching, going, Lord, how do you want me to share the gospel today? Lord, where are you at work? Where is your kingdom coming on earth as it is in heaven today? Help me to see this. Join him in it. Bear witness. Do the stuff. Now I'm going to comment on that a little more in just a moment. But this comes from John Wimber, back in the day when he first became a believer. And he read about all this stuff that Christians believe and do, and he was excited. He'd read the Gospels, and he goes to the church and, doesn't see a lot of it happening. And so he actually remembers asking the question of someone in the church, when do we get to do the stuff? And he's talking about healing. He's talking about prophesying. He's talking about casting out demons. He's talking about those things. And John Mark Comer says, we've got to do the stuff. We've got to actually still believe that the Lord is powerful, that the Lord is working. We've absolutely got to believe that the enemy is still working. that people are still demonized. The enemy is still attacking people. And perhaps we have the key to their freedom. Live a beautiful life. Comer's point is that our role isn't simply to preach at people, to try and transfer information. Our life has to line up with the gospel. Our life has to demonstrate the gospel. Preaching the gospel has to be a way of life for us. In the Great Commission, Jesus says, "As you go, make disciples." And even though we can talk about Jesus' ministry in these three key aspects or rhythms, they weren't really separate activities. These three things, make space for the gospel, preach the gospel, demonstrate the gospel. This is what Jesus did as he went, and he shifted between them depending on the moment. It's all about living under God's kingship, living out the ways of the kingdom, and helping others to see the kingdom. Now, I've put this slide up to just kind of highlight, all of those 5 points on the left. That's John Mark Comer talking about preaching the gospel. That's his tips on how we need to do that. Now, he didn't actually do this in the book, but I go, this is what he's done. He's highlighted that this ministry of preaching the gospel involves all of what Jesus did. Make space for the gospel. Demonstrate the gospel. It's all in there. So healing, deliverance, prophecy, and justice, that's the do the stuff. I'm not going to go any further into that today. There's a whole sermon series in that. If you would like to read what John Mark Comer says on those points, I'm happy to scan and give you a copy of that section of the book. So I just want to pause now and ask, what is most holding you back from preaching the gospel? Is it one of those areas that were up on the screen a moment ago? Is there one aspect of it that you really struggle with? Or is it something else? It's worth taking time to think about that, to pause and explore. Now, if there is a healthy caution that you have, that you don't want to come across as judging someone or badgering someone or invading their space, that's fine. Jesus teaches us to look for persons of peace. He says, don't preach the gospel where it isn't welcome. He says, shake the dust off your sandals. But I also want you to consider, is something else holding you back? Do you really believe that Jesus is good news? Not just for you, but for the person around you, for the people in your life. Because if you aren't excited about Jesus, if you haven't seen him answering any prayers recently, if you've stopped praying, maybe preaching the gospel isn't the part of your apprenticeship that you need to be focusing on either. Maybe it's to go back and focus on being with him, getting to know him. And on that, I'm going to invite Rick to come and help us do just that.